In the vast, churning waters of the South China Sea, a single unassuming American spy plane flew what was supposed to be a routine surveillance mission. It was April 1, 2001. The date, a strange premonition of the absurdity and confusion that would soon unfold. The aircraft, a U.S. Navy EP-3E Ares II, was packed with advanced electronic intelligence equipment and a crew of 24 specialists, listening in on the whispers of the Chinese military. This was a common practice, a shadowy dance of espionage played out in international airspace, just miles from the coast of China's Hainan Island. But on this particular day, the dance would turn into a dangerous collision, a moment in history when the two most powerful nations on Earth would stare into the abyss of war. This is the story of the Hainan Island incident, a forgotten crisis that brought America and China to the brink. The morning sky was clear as the EP-3, call sign PR-32, methodically traced its path along the Chinese coastline. These missions were a critical part of American intelligence gathering, a way to monitor military buildups, communications, and electronic signatures. The crew, a mix of young sailors and seasoned officers, were experts in their field, comfortable with the inherent risks of flying so close to a rival power. They had been intercepted by Chinese fighter jets before. It was a standard procedure, a show of force, a way for Beijing to say, "We see you." But the intercepts were usually professional, a high-stakes but predictable ballet of aviation. Today, however, something was different. Two Chinese J-82 interceptor jets rocketed up to meet the lumbering American turboprop. One of them was piloted by Lieutenant Commander Wang Wei. His approach was notoriously aggressive, a maverick style that had earned him a reputation among U.S. aircrews. He would fly dangerously close, sometimes just feet away from the American planes, gesturing and maneuvering in a way that pushed the boundaries of safe aviation. Inside the EP-3, the atmosphere tensed. The American pilot, Lieutenant Shane Osborne, kept his hands steady on the controls. He was just 26 years old, but he was responsible for the lives of 23 others and a billion-dollar piece of military hardware. Through the cockpit window, he could see Wang Wei's jet, a sleek silver dart, dancing around his much larger, slower aircraft. The Chinese pilot made several passes, each one more audacious than the last. He flew under the EP-3, then pulled up abruptly in front of its nose, a move designed to intimidate and disrupt. The American crew held their breath. This wasn't the usual protocol. This was reckless. On the third pass, the unthinkable happened. At 9:15 a.m. local time, Wang Wei's fighter jet collided with the EP-3's outer left propeller. The sound was a horrifying shriek of metal on metal, a violent, catastrophic failure that ripped through the airframe. The impact sent both aircraft into a deadly spiral. The J-82, its tail section sheared off, broke apart almost instantly. Lieutenant Commander Wang Wei ejected, his parachute a fleeting white speck against the blue of the sea before he vanished. For the American crew, their own fight for survival had just begun. The EP-3 nosedived violently, plunging towards the ocean at an alarming rate. Alarms blared through the cabin. Debris flew. The nose cone had been sheared off, and the impact had damaged the number 1 propeller and sent shrapnel tearing into the fuselage. Lieutenant Osborne wrestled with the controls, his co-pilot by his side, fighting the laws of physics. The plane was falling thousands of feet per minute. Osborne shouted orders, his voice cutting through the chaos, instructing the crew to brace for impact or prepare to bail out. For several agonizing seconds, it seemed the aircraft was doomed, another tragic loss in the cold calculus of international espionage. Miraculously, after a terrifying descent of over 8,000 feet, Osborne regained a measure of control. The plane was severely damaged, barely flyable, but it was stable. They were alive. But their ordeal was far from over. They were deep in hostile territory, flying a crippled spy plane with no way to make it back to their home base in Japan. The nearest runway was on China's Hainan Island, the very military outpost they had been sent to surveil. They had no choice. Osborne declared a mayday and began an emergency descent towards Lingshui airfield. As the plane limped towards the ground, another critical mission began in the back. The intelligence crew, knowing they were about to land in China, initiated emergency destruction procedures. Their orders were clear. Under no circumstances could the sensitive materials and top-secret equipment on board fall into enemy hands. They frantically shredded documents, smashed hard drives with an axe, and dumped classified equipment into the sea through a ditching hatch. It was a race against time, a desperate attempt to protect the nation's secrets even as their own fate hung in the balance. The moment the wheels of the EP-3 touched down on Chinese soil, the 24 Americans ceased to be a flight crew and became international pawns. They were immediately surrounded by armed Chinese soldiers. The crew was ordered off the plane and taken into custody. They were no longer airmen. They were detainees, their futures uncertain. The standoff had begun. In Washington, D.C., the news hit the White House like a shockwave. President George W. Bush, only in his third month in office, was faced with his first major international crisis. The situation was a diplomatic minefield. A U.S. military aircraft, packed with surveillance technology, was now in the hands of the Chinese government. The crew was being held captive, and the Chinese pilot was missing, presumed dead. The potential for escalation was enormous. Hardliners in both Washington and Beijing began rattling their sabers. In America, there were calls for a swift, forceful response to secure the release of the crew and the return of the plane. In China, nationalist sentiment surged, with state media portraying the U.S. as an arrogant aggressor, and the missing pilot Wang Wei as a national hero who died defending his homeland. The diplomatic negotiations were fraught with tension. The two nations were speaking different languages, not just literally, but culturally and politically. The U.S. demanded the immediate return of its crew and aircraft, framing the incident as an accident in international airspace caused by a reckless Chinese pilot. The Chinese, however, demanded a full apology. They insisted the American plane had violated their airspace and was responsible for the collision. For them, it was a matter of national sovereignty and honor, a chance to stand up to what they saw as American hegemony. Neither side was willing to back down. For 11 long days, the world watched as the two giants stood locked in a tense stalemate. The American crew was held in a guest house in Haikou, the capital of Hainan. They were interrogated repeatedly but were not physically harmed. Back home, their families waited in agony, their faces a constant presence on the nightly news, a human symbol of the high-stakes geopolitical drama playing out across the Pacific. Behind the scenes, diplomats worked around the clock to find a solution, a way to de-escalate the crisis without either side losing face. The key, as it so often is in diplomacy, was language. The Bush administration refused to issue a formal apology, which would have been seen as an admission of guilt. Instead, after days of careful linguistic gymnastics, a compromise was reached. The U.S. ambassador to China, Joseph Pruher, delivered a carefully worded letter to the Chinese Foreign Ministry. The letter stated that the United States was very sorry for the death of the Chinese pilot and for the plane entering Chinese airspace without verbal clearance. The phrase "very sorry" was the breakthrough. To the Americans, it was an expression of regret, not an apology. To the Chinese, it was close enough. It was the face-saving gesture they needed. On April 12th, the 24 crew members were released and flown out of China to Guam, where they were greeted as heroes. But the story wasn't over. The crippled EP-3 spy plane remained on Hainan Island. The Chinese government refused to allow it to be repaired and flown out. They wanted to examine it, to reverse engineer its sophisticated intelligence-gathering technology. American experts were convinced that China was stripping the plane of its secrets. For 3 months, the disassembled aircraft sat on the tarmac at Lingshui, a symbol of the lingering mistrust between the two nations. Finally, an agreement was reached. The U.S. would pay for the costs of dismantling the plane and shipping it back in pieces aboard a chartered Russian cargo plane. It was a humiliating, but necessary, conclusion to the saga. In July 2001, the remains of the EP-3 were finally returned to American soil. Its secrets likely compromised, its mission ending not with a whisper, but with the clang of dismantled parts being loaded into a foreign transport. The Hainan Island incident was a stark reminder of how quickly a routine military operation can spiral into a full-blown international crisis. It exposed the deep-seated mistrust and strategic rivalry that simmered just beneath the surface of the U.S.-China relationship. While the immediate crisis was resolved through delicate diplomacy, the underlying tensions never went away. The event served as a catalyst for China to accelerate its military modernization, determined never again to be in such a position of perceived weakness. For the United States, it was a lesson in the new complexities of dealing with a rising, more assertive China. Today, U.S. and Chinese military assets continue to operate in close proximity in the South China Sea. The intercepts continue. The potential for a miscalculation, for another collision, remains ever present. The story of the crew of PR-32 is a forgotten chapter in recent history. A moment when two nations teetered on the edge, a chilling preview of the geopolitical challenges that would come to define the 21st century. It stands as a cautionary tale of how, in the blink of an eye, the delicate balance of power can be shattered, and the world can find itself just one mistake away from war.